Chapter 4 Engineers Mars Classified Location 1 month, 10 days after longboat FTL jump. Lincoln winced as the charges went off. The reinforcements that the General's team had put in place would mitigate most of the damage. Still, a particle accelerator of any size was a delicate piece of machinery, and setting off explosives directly on top of it was bound to cause some damage. Considering the damage that had been wrought in the CERN incident from a single misalignment, she was going to have to go over the thing with a fine-tooth comb. Not a task she was looking forward to. Still, the illusion had to be maintained. The crowd around her burst into tumultuous applause. Several of the more impulsive members even started yelling, "You should be celebrating, no more antimatter." Lincoln turned to look at the man, a Martian politician, if his clothes were to go by. She had also seen his face in broadcasts before, meaning he had to be someone of at least marginal importance. "Senator Daniels," said the man, extending his hand out to her. Lincoln ignored it. "All I see is a pointless waste of resources in engineering. That accelerator would be able to easily fuel several more tests of the longboat, as well as perhaps even larger ships." The politician slowly lowered his hand, a fake grin plastering itself on his face. "I suppose, but the antimatter it produced could also have been used in weapons of mass destruction. Both our governments agreed to never produce such weapons ever again, and from what I understand, the FTL program is on hold while analysts go over the date of your historic flight. The longboat has been mothballed as well so that she can be analysed." Lincoln smiled and, reaching over to a tray, picked up a small flute of champagne. "You know, when history looks back on this, I'm sure they will only see it as a delay. Humanity can, for the first time, reach the stars, but fools like you and those in my own government are too cowardly to do anything." Sipping the drink, Lincoln stared at the man. To his credit, he didn't flinch away from her gaze. He was a seasoned politician. The words of a scientist with no support were hardly a threat. "Perhaps, but at least our children will be able to look back and say we were too slow." Lincoln laughed. "They will look back from the stars we could visit today, Senator. Now leave me be while I lament the loss of the stars." The Senator considered ignoring her for a moment, but with a sigh left her and ambled over to the opposite side of the transport to mingle with those who had more influence. Lincoln sipped at the champagne and looked out at the smoking crater that was the particle accelerator. She was seriously looking forward to her upcoming snap. It would be an incredibly cathartic event. Yamato, Mars Station, 1 month, 10 days after longboat FTL jump. Setting the wrench in place and bracing herself against the bulkhead, Megan pulled. For a moment the seal panel remained steadfastly stuck before breaking loose, moved and gave way. Careful to keep herself braced in the 0G, Megan quickly had the panel off and unconcerned tossed the metal over her shoulder. "Hey!" shouted Ben. Megan ignored her assistant and carefully began to check all the wiring for the fault. "You know, whenever you're grouchy, I'm the one who invariably ends up in medical. Could you stop chucking stuff?" Pushing herself away from the panel, Megan turned around in the air and pushed off out the panel. "We're still waiting those replacement capacitors. I thought Mars was supposed to be some powerhouse of efficient production. I put in the request there days ago. So out of boredom you've decided to tear apart the toilet's electrical systems. You mess them up and no one will be happy." Megan scowled at him. Ben had been her assistant in engineering throughout the entire war and had long ago been qualified enough to transfer to being a chief engineer on any ship in the fleet. Like the entirety of the Yamato crew, he liked his posting, and the camaraderie that had formed on the ship had turned the name Yamato into a modern legend. The more dangerous or unlikely a mission was to be successfully completed, all that Terran Command had to do was assign to Yamato. "I'm nervous, all right. Those FTL modifications are going to be murder on her," said Megan as she hit the hull plate of the ship. "So you're perfectly fine with the concept of flying through some lower dimension or something? But you're worried what the new systems will do to the Yamato? Isn't it higher dimensions?" asked Megan. Ben shrugged. "I've no idea." "I mean, have you looked at all the modifications we're going to have to do? These giant emitters all over the hull, as well as a half dozen more circuits and some power hug of a core. We're also apparently going to have to modify 2 of the missile launchers to be ultra precise, otherwise we blow ourselves up. I know all that, still we've got time to relax. The captain doesn't want to leave too quickly, or even the politicians would be able to figure it out. Ben absent-mindedly nodded. Alright, you been over to the station yet? Asked Ben. No, you're not asking me out on a date again, are you? Asked Megan as she crossed her arms and glared at the man. Yeah, every guy wants to date the woman chucking 2-kilogram pieces of metal at his head. I'm asking if you want to get away from the politicians. Megan grimaced. Alright, fine. Moving down the central corridor of the Yamato, the 2 of them expertly utilising the available handholds, Ben and Megan drifted into the bridge of the ship. Designed almost like an old-fashioned submarine, the bridge was only a little off from being in the centre of the longship. Captain Takuya was floating near his chair, listening to what looked like the North American diplomat, no doubt complaining about the accommodations of the Yamato again. The captain spotted his 2 senior engineers, and both of them caught the quick flash of annoyance in his eyes. Ben smiled and gave the captain a thumbs up as they drifted behind the ambassador. Moving up to the midship airlock where the Yamato was docked with the station, Ben opened the inner hatch and pushing off the wall, the Yamato drifted into it. Megan followed and quickly sealed it behind her. The pressures equalized and the 2 floated out into the airlock of the station. A small girl with a halo of pale blonde around her head floating in every direction but no more than 3 inches long looked at them as they entered the station. You want a tour? Asked the girl. Ben blinked. Oh, what? A tour? My mother told me to be nice to the Terrans now, so I'm giving tours of the station. You could go and see Romeo and Juliet and 0G at the theatre, or go down thither and get some shopping done, or maybe grab something to eat. The station is famous for its 0G cuisine. All of the Terrans I've introduced to it are raving, said the girl. As she rattled off the options, she slowly pirouetted in the air, continuing to talk even as she was faced away from them. What about the engineering sections? Asked Megan. The girl paused. What? The older parts of the station, the backbone, so to speak. I'm still amazed that Mars was able to build this. The station was what had won Mars the war, with only a third the gravity of Earth to contend with. It had been difficult but not impossible for them to construct the space elevator. It had taken almost a decade, and they had finished it only a few years before the war had broken out. With the ability to cheaply move objects into and out of orbit without relying on rockets, the Martians had been able to compete with the Earth despite the massive differences in numbers and developed resources. Off limits before the war and so heavily guarded during it, few Terran engineers had actually been able to see it. Even during the war, it was held up as an example of what human engineering could accomplish by both sides. You want to see the engineering compartments? Asked the girl, looking bemused. Ben groaned. We worked in engineering all day. You have the chance to take in Martian culture and, more importantly, food. And you want to go crawling through some dusty compartments? Asked Ben. Megan nodded. How old is the core of the station? Ben frowned. 100 years or so, right? Asked Ben, turning to the girl. She nodded, causing her hair to bounce around in every direction. It was originally the Earth transfer craft, which was turned into a station which was eventually attached to the elevator, said the girl. You telling me you don't want to see what it was like 100 years ago? Asked Megan. Ben sighed. Fine, but after this I choose where we go. The little girl smiled. All right, my first customer. She held out her hand. Ben looked at her for a moment. He never mentioned the price. The little girl smiled. If you want to see the oldest sections, it will be extra. Mother says never do something for free if you can get them to pay. I'm not sure that's the best lesson. You get paid after we see the older sections. Deal? Asked Ben. The little girl frowned. Megan fished a small credit chit from a pocket and lightly tossed it through the air. The girl launched herself off the side of the airlock she was on, grabbing the shit. Rebounding, flew out the exit. Hurry up, let's go, she shouted. The 2 engineers looked at one another and then at the hatch. Welcome to Mars, said Megan. Emperor, homeworld, palace. 1 month, 10 days after longboat FTL jump. Charles, turned and stunned for only a half moment, quickly raised his hand and put it over his right eye. Consul, I'm sorry I didn't see you. Marcus waved his hand and Charles hesitantly lowered his salute. I need you to do something for me, Captain. Anything, sir. I need you to make the right call and obtain the alien FTL technology by any means at your disposal. Charles blinked, not sure what to make of this. The high scientists are suggesting that the method might be to try and obtain the data for the FTL system in a clandestine manner. Should that prove impossible or too time-consuming, you are to move forward with the extermination of the planet and acquire the FTL technology through any means possible. Could you clarify that, sir? Take the prototype if needed, and then eliminate the species, said Marcus. It had been nearly a month at this point. The usual analysis that was done before a race was eliminated took place over decades. Species C1764, however, had been given only a month of consideration and rush planning. Charles had been to every briefing and analysis of the data his team had collected, but even he was beginning to reach capacity. The young Emperor was no longer attending the meetings, not that anyone held that against him. Charles had only left to the most recent briefing to try and sort everything out in his head when the consul had apparently followed him out. Does that mean I will be selected to command the Singer? Marcus nodded. You will be, yes. Charles looked the consul over. The man was for the moment the de facto emperor. The emperor, barely more than a child at the moment, he was the one running the empire. Even if by all technicality he was only an advisor, and Charles had no official obligation to follow his orders, to disobey him would not end well. I'll ensure that I acquire the technology then. Marcus smiled and briefly put his own hand over his eye, saluting him. Thank you, Captain. Now I think the both of us should return to the briefing. I'm sure you have as much of a headache as I do, but I suppose their analysis is important. The man turned, and still smiling and exuding an air of casual control, he strode back into the briefing. Trying to calm his own nerves, Charles followed after him. He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite all evidence that the man was honourable in his position, that something was off with the consul. Not that he would ever voice such concerns. Doing so was liable to get him killed. Yamato, Mars Station, 1 month 10 days after longboat FTL jump. I'm not sure we're supposed to be here, said Ben as he rebounded off of the nearest panel, throwing up a cloud of dust. I come here all the time, said the little girl. That's not convincing me we should be here, said Ben. Megan, looking through everything, carefully moved a hastily constructed panel out of the way, revealing an ancient hatch. What's behind there? Asked Megan. The girl already ahead of them down the small access corridor shrugged. I don't know, never been in here. Bracing herself against the handle, Megan pulled at the lever. The hatch mechanism groaned but didn't budge. Come over here and help me, you idiot. Ben floated over to her and grabbed the handle, carefully bracing himself as well. Are we sure there's not a vacuum the other side of the hatch? Megan tapped the side of the hatch and the seal that was in place. If there was a vacuum on the other side, the pressure of the atmosphere where they were would keep the thing sealed. You're strong, Ben, but not that strong. It's just stuck. Rolling his eyes quickly, Ben turned the wheel, braking whatever had the thing stuck, spinning the latch until it hit home. The seal broke, and a blast of hot, stale air ran out from the compartment. The hatch was blown outwards, throwing Ben against the far wall of the service corridor with a solid thump. Ignoring the fact that he might be injured, both women, young and old, drifted into the compartment. Coughing and pushing junk that had floated out of the room away from him, Ben pushed off of the far wall and joined the two. Small compartment smelled musty, and in every corner was a small collection of debris. The only light was filtering into the room from a ridiculously small porthole. Reaching into her belt, Megan pulled out her firefly, a small LED array in the form of a sphere, and switching it on slowly, pushed it into the room. Looking slowly, floated into the compartment, and the words on the wall, printed in faded black paint, came into view. Observation deck. This must be the really old part of the station. One of the first components put up 100 years ago, said the girl as she excitedly began to bounce from wall to wall in the small space. Ben nodded in agreement. Floating up to a small window in the middle of the deck, Ben peered out. The entire station and the long black-grey tether leading down to the Martian surface obscured most of his view, but beyond the red planet was the familiar vista of stars. Why was this place abandoned? Asked the girl, suddenly freezing on one of the walls. Ben tore his eyes away from the tiny window. The Yamato, for all her glory, didn't have windows. She had displays embedded into some of the walls that showed live feeds from the outside. and even though he shouldn't have been able to notice the difference, they were so high in fidelity that there was just something off about them. Staring out through a weak piece of transparent material into the void was entirely different. That corridor must have been the original station backbone, but over the years it was converted into a service crawlway. It goes almost through the exact centre of the station, right next to the tether. Once the Martians got orbital construction down, they could build better structures. Megan tapped the side of the outer hole around one of the windows. Look at the weld. It was done in gravity, manufactured on the surface and brought up. They don't do that nowadays, she said. Well, you wanted to see the old part of the station. Here it is, said Ben. The original module. I know, I've seen pictures of stuff like this, but it's amazing to actually see it. I mean, look at this. Megan pointed at the control panel along the side of the wall. Wires were leading out from it in every direction, spidering along the wall in a confusing, haphazard mass. It's simple, frighteningly so. Everything was so exposed back then and put together by people that had no idea what they were doing, eager to simply have something that worked. Nowadays, exposed wiring is against regulation, and I'll bet that panel's hot-wired as hell. Do that on a modern station and you'll get fined, said Megan as she thumbed over the mass of wires, removing a small layer of dust from them. The little girl frowned. There is no station better than this one. Mother said so. Megan smiled slightly. I'm sure there is no station as diverse as this one, but in terms of engineering, the only impressive thing is the tether. Still, this station feels like an actual city, haphazard and constructed without a plan. All the stations in orbit of Earth are planned out to the last millimetre. You say that like it's a bad thing, said Ben, somewhat bemused. Megan chuckled. Mars was at the beginning a new frontier. It didn't matter what kind of degree you had or if some university signed off saying you could do something. All that mattered was that you could do it. The people in the first wave knew they were only moments from death at any time from a breach or a radiation burst. But the crazy bastards still did it. They didn't need a plan, they had the will. You do remember all those missions we did in the war, right? There were no safety margins there, and we didn't always follow regulation when fixing our engines or the weapons. I wouldn't call that fun, growled Ben, remembering the many times they had been only a hasty patch job or repair away from destruction. Megan pursed her lips. That's not the same thing and you know it. Fighting and improvising to survive a battle is completely different from bootstrapping a colony. I get that, but think about it. Humanity is FTL now. When we do eventually start colonies, is every one of them going to be the Wild West all over again? Is each going to be a haphazard mess that... No offence, Ben turned to look at the little girl. She frowned and crossed her arms, glaring at him. That has to slowly clean itself up. Why not? In the end, the frontier eventually becomes the norm. Then it only means we have to expand again, said Megan. The two stared at one another for several moments until eventually the girl spoke up. I'm fine with the station like it is now. She pushed off away from the porthole, and her youthful exuberance ran directly into the rat's nest of wiring. The lights on the outside section of the station flashed on and off. A wailing alarm went off for a half second before it was silenced. Ancient spotlights, apparently just outside the porthole, which had once been used to guide ships towards the original primitive space station, flashed on, glaring down the main observation level of the modern station, blinding several dozen Earth politicians as well as a large group of Martians who were on break enjoying lunch. Even when that happens, asked Ben. Yep, although that was your fault. The girl leapt from the next nest of wires, hitting Ben in the chest, and rebounding off of him, she flew with supreme grace into the service corridor and out of sight. The two engineers watched her go and then glanced at one another and then at the bundle of wiring. You want to explain this? Asked Megan. Ben shook his head. Nope. I say we follow our illustrious guide's example. What? Rob some tours. She palmed your pocket when she hit you. Ben blinked and his hand shot down to its pants pocket. Motherfucker. Megan chuckled and grabbing the hatch swung back into the service corridor, and even as the lights continued to flicker, swearing under his breath, Ben followed. They made it back to the Yamato just as the first disgruntled Martian technician made it to the ancient room, and floating up to the massive wires whacked it once, fixing the problem. Yamato, Mars Station, 1 month 11 days after longboat FTL jump. No, said Megan. Oh, come on, said Ben. I'm not going with you to a strip club. nor am I lending you credits to go to one, said Megan as she tapped her foot on the deck plate she was looped into. It's a zero-G strip club, said Ben, as if that were justification enough. No, restaurant then? You don't have any credits. You're buying then. I'll pay you back, said Ben. Megan rolled her eyes and pushed off the deck plate. Fine, but we're going to the down tether area. I want to see it, said Megan. Ben smiled. So do I. The best bar in the station is apparently in there. You want to get drunk in zero-G, be my guest, but I am not dragging you back to the Yamato. Ben ignored her and, hopping off the wall of the airlock, shot into the depths of the station, careful to avoid anyone who looked like they might want to take his credits. The down tether area was at the core of the station and being protected by the mass of all other compartments around it. It was the largest open compartment in orbit of either Earth or Mars, shaped like a massive cylinder. It was nearly 140 metres in diameter and 200 metres long. The black-grey line that tethered the station to Mars far below ran directly through its centre. It was one of the few locations inside the station where the line was not hidden away or behind some bulkhead. The Martian engineers had designed it to rotate and create artificial gravity, but by the time construction was complete, too many businesses had already adapted to the zero-G aesthetic of the station. And with the introduction of nanomachines around the same time, which could compensate for many of the adverse effects of weightlessness, the giant cylinder had never once turned. The Martian engineers of the time had taken this in stride and adapted to the zero-G themselves, simply strung up a large network of lines throughout the massive cylinder to aid in navigation through it. The Martians, keeping with their motto of crazed construction, had built what could only be described as a three-dimensional market. Vendors tethering their boots to the lines and floating in them selling and flogging wares. As Ben and Megan made their way towards the down tether from the airlock of the Yamato, the corridors only grew more congested with foot traffic in the zero-G. Most people were pulling themselves along in lines strung through the ceiling or were crawling along the walls. The only people bouncing back and forth between the walls were children and turned tourists. The station had an official population of 5,000, but the actual number of humans on it at any given time was much higher. The station was the main economic and transportation hub for the planet. Raw asteroids dragged in from the asteroid belt were docked with her and quickly stripped of metals. Ships were constructed in the massive shipyards in orbit next to her, and nearly all foot traffic to and from orbit went through the station due to the ease of access. The only craft that didn't routinely have at least some interaction with the station were the military vehicles, which, much like those of Earth, were for all but the largest, designed to operate with minimal support infrastructure and could actually land and achieve orbit of the red planet under their own power. Ben and Megan both suddenly found themselves thrust out of the small corridor they had been in and into the down tether area. For a moment both engineers stared in awe of the structure around them. That was until a disgruntled Martian businessman, apparently annoyed with their rubbernecking, pushed past them, sending them tumbling in opposite directions. "The bar?" asked Ben as they quickly found each other again. "The bar." Grabbing the nearest rope, Ben pulled himself up to the correct angle and then launched down towards the middle of the cylinder, with Megan not far behind. The bar wrapped around the tether in the centre of the cylinder, running almost the entire length of the chamber. Several dozen waiters were buzzing along the tether, stopping at intervals where drinks were stored in compartments, which also happened to be the anchor points for the internal lines of the cylinder. Drifting over to a table, Ben slipped his feet into the holes and Megan quickly joined him. A menu popped up on the surface of the table, offering the wide selection of Martian drinks, all but the most expensive being potato-based. "Any preference?" asked Megan. "Nothing with potatoes." Megan smiled and slid a credit into the table. "I'll have the Olympus suite, my friend the Acidalia," said Megan to the table. The menu winked out, and within moments a waitress drifted down to them, 2 plastic bags with embedded magnets holding them to her tray. "Anything else?" asked the waitress. She didn't look like she was older than 18 in Earth terms, yet she towered over both Ben and Megan, her height no doubt from the low gravity of Mars and working on the station. The lanky build was common amongst the Martians. "Very good," said Megan as she picked up the bag and, placing it to her lips, took a quick gulp of the liquid, wincing as it burned down her throat. Back in the academy she had downed harder liquors and in greater quantities, but during the war those types of vices had fallen on the wayside. All right, just call me if you need anything else, she said, then expertly jumped back up into the air, small gas jets firing from a rather bulky belt around her waist. All the servers had the small things which helped them get around in the zero-G even with their hands full. How they were controlling them, Megan wasn't sure. This place is amazing, said Ben as he craned his neck, looking around the inner surface of the cylinder and the hundreds of small shops that were suspended around the cylinder. Megan nodded in agreement. None of the shops were corporation storefronts. The station didn't let them set up in the cylinder, so the closest analogue to the inside of the surface was the ancient Middle Eastern market she had only seen in movies. It was disorganized, loud, and despite the need for cleanliness and space, a little dirty. Unlike the downtown areas of Earth, which were clinically clean, immaculate, and occupied by the storefronts for corporations, this place was alive. Ben glanced, watched as people flew between the stalls, trailing lines of purchases and knickknacks flying with them. The residents of the stations were climbing along the lines with expert ease, flying past one another in some crazed and almost choreographed dance, avoiding on one another by only inches as they flew in opposite directions at speeds that, if they were to have impact, would have hurt quite a bit. Megan took another sip of her own drink and stuck it down the table. I never thought I would get to see this. What do you mean? The station was always a target during the war. I mean, the Martians can launch things almost for free from here. We could never get through the defences around it. Heck, when it came into line for a kinetic bombardment, the Martians put one of the largest frigates in between Earth and the station, then overpressurized her as much as possible. The one rod that made it through the frigate just glanced off the station. They nearly lost the counterweight from the oscillations it caused in the structure. If that had happened, this entire place would have fallen into the atmosphere, said Megan. That would have probably let us win the war, said Ben. Megan nodded and ruefully took another sip of her drink, draining the pouch. Ben glanced down at his own, which was still mostly full. Need more? Megan shook her head and leaned back from the table, letting herself float, keeping herself in place with only the footholds. It had been 5 years since she had been able to relax, and even now she could still feel that knot of tension in her stomach. She doubted would ever go completely away, especially with the upcoming mission. You Terrans? Growled a voice to Megan's right. Slowly Megan opened her eyes, already dreading what the voice was implying. A man who was slightly bulkier than the average Martian, with a crew cut and a large scar on his arm, was floating above their table, manoeuvring jets, occasionally firing off around him, keeping him in place. So what if we are? Asked Ben, keeping his voice neutral as he took another sip of his own drink. I would ask what the hell you're doing here after what your politicians just tried to pull, growled the man. Megan and Ben glanced at one another, and lazily reaching into her pocket, Megan extracted her link to read the news. Looking unconcerned, Ben closed his eyes and took another sip of his drink. What did they do this time? He asked. We're apparently demanding reparations from Mars. Ben groaned. We dragged those idiots across the solar system, and this is what they do. Are they trying to start another war? Apparently, said Megan. Looked up, and around them she could see other Martians beginning to gather around them. The two of them had changed out their Yamato jumpsuits, but even so, it was fairly obvious they were Terran. Together, Ben and Megan hadn't spent more than 100 days on Earth's surface in the past 5 years. Still, their skin tone was darker than the haunting pallor that was common among Martians. The fact that the two of them were also much more solidly built and a full head shorter than most everyone else around them also made them easily identifiable. You started that war and now you want us to pay for it, demanded the man as he bobbed side to side in the air. Megan winced as he yelled, smelling his breath. The man was apparently drunk. How he was managing to navigate in zero-G as smashed as he was, Megan had no idea. Let's go, Ben said as he quickly put his pouch down. Megan nodded in agreement, and bending down slightly, she pulled her feet out of the brace and got ready to move. The last thing that either of them wanted to do was incite an incident that would be blown out of proportion. Hendrik, a woman shouted. Everyone in the gathering crowd immediately froze, including those few who had been floating towards another handhold, causing them to go tumbling off away from the bar and out into several annoyed vendors. Slowly the drunk turned towards the source of the yell, as did everybody else, including the two engineers. A woman who looked as if she should have her own gravitational field floated over. What seemed to be 3 jury-rigged cold jet belts that people were using to navigate through the cylinder. Even with 3 of them, the jets were struggling to null out any movement she made. How she fit anywhere in the station, Ben had no idea. The woman drifted up to the man, and despite his height, he looked tiny compared to the somewhat squat woman. You start another fight, and I swear I'll toss you through the airlock. The gathering crowd already almost gone. The man drunkenly nodded. All right. Slowly he fired the jets and drifted off towards the entrance to the cylinder, looking for all the world like a scolded puppy. The large woman glared at his retreating form for several moments, and threw dirty glances at the few that were lingering before turning to the table. I'm sorry about that. He can be a little loose-lipped when he's drunk. Thanks, but we would have been fine, said Megan. Ah, but then I would have had to kick the both of you out along with the prick. Zero tolerance policy and all that, said the large woman with a wink. You're the first Terrans who haven't come in a pack of 10 or so. Yeah, well, I needed a drink, grumbled Ben as he finished off his own pouch of beer and threw it back on the table where it stuck with a metallic clang. I'm Janice, I own the bar, she said. In that moment some sort of projectile hit the woman, and even with her mask she was moved backward slightly. You, shouted Ben. The little girl who was practically sitting on Janice's shoulder froze, and turned to look at Ben. Oh shit, she squealed. Pushing off the giant woman's shoulder, she launched herself into the air with another display of blinding speed. Janice's arm shot up in an even faster move and grabbed the little girl's leg, dragged her back down, holding her upside down compared to everyone else at the table. Janice frowned. You two seem to know one another. What did she do? Asked Janice. I gave them a tour, shouted the girl. Ben was looking between the two with some concern, unsure what the gigantic woman would do to the child. As much as he wanted the credits back, he didn't want anything to happen to her. What did she do? Repeated Janice as she shook the girl. Stole a few credits, I think. I could have lost them too. He lost them, said the girl, whimpering. What have I told you? Asked Janice, staring at the small girl. Don't get caught. If you're going to anger someone, make sure it's worth it. Janice rolled her eyes and let go of the girl's leg. The blonde quickly righted in comparison to them and turned to face Ben. Yes, those are exactly the things you should be learning. Apologize to the man. The little girl threw Janice a dirty look and then turned to Ben. I'm sorry. Ben nodded. Oh, it's fine. You gave us a good tour. Janice sighed and, reaching into her belt, pulled out a credit chip and tossed it at Ben. That about right for what you took? Ben glanced at the chip. No, way less than that. Keep it. Ben nodded. The general mood the woman gave off was one of a person who would get their way whether you liked it or not. At this point he was simply going to agree with her to keep her from doing something to him. What that something would be, he had no idea, but it wouldn't end well, he knew that much. Quite the place, said Ben, awkwardly changing the subject. That it is. I built it from the ground up. You have no idea how hard it was to figure out how to clamp wood to the cable. Still, I like the aesthetic of an old-fashioned Terran bar. Megan nodded in agreement and tapped the table. This is outdated even for art. I haven't seen a place with decor like this in anything but movies. The massive woman shrugged. I have an old-fashioned way of doing things. Then, it's the largest bar in the station, so it attracts something of a rough crowd. That drunk from earlier, apparently my daughter now as well included in that category. The girl, apparently pouting, was floating inches off the table, slowly turning in a circle, glaring at the adults around her. I don't see that much security, said Ben. Janice grinned. I don't usually have that much trouble, so station security hardly ever needs to stop by. The ones who do cause trouble, well, they don't cause trouble anymore. Janice trailed off from there and, leaning forward, slipped her feet into the slots in the floor, effectively joining them at the table. So, you two on a date? Seeing the station? Ben coughed and grabbed at his empty drink bag. No, yes, I mean we're seeing the station, but we're not dating. I understand, said Janice. Turning, she shot a sidelong glance at Megan, who only closed her eyes and imperceptibly shook her head. Janice chuckled. Well, I won't get in your way of the tour then, and neither will my daughter. Reaching out, Janice grabbed the girl and, pulling the child to her shoulder, set her down there. The girl grabbed onto the cold jet belt that was looped around her mother's shoulder and held on. I wouldn't go to the upper ring. I'm in charge down here, but up by the bureaucrat offices, things are a little dicey for Terence. Thanks, we'll keep that in mind, said Megan. You have any plans after ordering another round of drinks? Asked Janice. Not really, be a tourist, said Ben. Janice smiled. In that case, make sure you visit Ambrosia, or perhaps the observation deck. Thanks, we'll look into them.